Epistles, 1 Timothy as a case study.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I have enjoyed learning from everyone since the first day of the conference. Before the first session, a group of scholars were sharing the tips on how to make a memorable presentation. One of them said, make sure to have an impressive title. And indeed, we have seen many creative titles at this conference. Similarly, titles and paratexts on manuscript influence and shape text reading. They bear important witnesses to early reception of the biblical text. In manuscript traditions, the three letters addressed to Paul's co-workers, Timothy and Titus, appear in the order of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, either after 2 Thessalonians or Hebrews. They have been known as the Pastoral Epistles since the 18th century. In the case of 1 Timothy, the claim that the letter originated from Laodicea is attested in most of its manuscript paratexts. In addition, they are found in paratexts of Colossians, and yet the word Laodicea is not mentioned in the main text of 1 Timothy. Is 1 Timothy the letter written from Laodicea? And how does this traditional identification influence the perception of the letter's provenance? This study examines the paratexts of 1 Timothy and Colossians to understand why 1 Timothy was received and interpreted as the Pauline letter from Laodicea. But first, let's look at what are paratexts. Paratexts are features that mediate the reception of a book to the reader in a literary work. In the study of biblical manuscripts, the term paratext generally refers to all contents in biblical manuscripts except the biblical text itself, including textual elements and non-textual elements that convey important meaning. For Greek manuscripts that contain paratexts, the most basic elements include the titular forms of inscriptions and subscriptions of each letter. They often contain information about each word's content. Further, some manuscripts contain the Euthalian apparatus. These paratexts provide important information on the reception of the biblical text, like 1 Timothy. More recently, I noticed the paratexts in the form of patenai or commentaries also provide insights into the letter's reception and interpretation. To illustrate, we will look at some examples of the paratexts of 1 Timothy and Colossians. These examples are part of the TINT research project, editing paratextual features in Greek New Testament manuscripts. As indicated in the table, the inscription of the three pastorals provide basic information about the letters, showing a progression from including the recipient's name to specifying the genre and author with specific titles and some manuscripts. They reflect the scribal perception of the pastoral Pauline authorship. In comparison to the inscription, the subscriptions are generally longer, except in some early manuscripts. Again, these examples are part of the TINT research project. For more on the subscriptions to 1 Timothy, please refer to the work of Thorpe and Professor Bosman. As shown in the table, the letter's place of origin, identified as Laodicea or Laodicείας, is first preserved in the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus. In the number of subscriptions, Laodicea is further specified as the capital of Phrygia Bagadiana. The phrase Phrygia Bagadiana was known in the 4th century and most likely added to the subscription after that time. A variant, Macedonia, is attested in several manuscripts. Sorry. As you can see, these include GA 36203. The identification of Macedonia as the place of origin for 1 Timothy may be due to a scribal attempt to harmonize the subscription with the text in 1 Timothy 1:3. However, the scribe of GA 203 misidentified Macedonia as the capital of Phrygia Bagadiana. This may also be a result of combining readings from different exemplars. The tension between the subscription and the text regarding the letter's place of origin is also found in the Euthalian apparatus of 1 Timothy. An 11th century manuscript GA 901 has Laodiceas in the hypothesis to 1 Timothy, but with the gloss Makedonias added in the right margin. Further, several manuscripts, including GA 177, have Makedonias preserved in the Euthalian hypothesis, while their subscriptions retain Laodiceas as the place of origin. The assertion of Makedonias in the paratext suggests that scribes or readers of these manuscripts may have noticed that the identification of Laodicea contradicts the text in 1 Timothy 1:3. Nevertheless, the assertion of 1 Timothy as originating from Laodicea is found in most Euthalian materials and the subscriptions, with its first occurrence in the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus. While there is no mention of Laodicea in the text of 1 Timothy, reference to Laodicea can be found in the letter addressed to the church in Colossae. Moreover, the explicit assertion that 1 Timothy is the letter from Laodicea, as mentioned in Colossians 4:16, is found in various paratexts in manuscript of Colossians. And we'll look at the paratexts of Colossians. A scholium, then bros dimatheon brodes legate, placed in the margins of the main text, is found in several manuscripts, including GA 2962. A longer version of the scholium with a quote from an unnamed source, remains passing party, is found in the margins of several 11th century manuscripts, including GA 424. Most of these manuscripts have commentaries that are likely anonymous, but attributed to a certain Euthalius or Ecumenius. According to the unnamed source, the letter was not sent by Paul to the Laodiceans, but from them to Paul. For he did not say to the Laodiceans, but from Laodicea. The same exegetical remark introduced by an unnamed source, but embedded in the frame catena attributed to Ecumenius from the 6th century, appears in several manuscripts, including the 10th century, GA 619. There were other prominent Greek commentators on the Pauline epistles before Ecumenius. These include John Chrysostom, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and Theodoret of Cyrus. As Professors Houghton and Parker have noted in their work, the earliest commentaries on the Pauline epistles are attributed to Ecumenius, and many of his materials are extracts taken from Chrysostom's commentaries on the Pauline epistle. The affirmation remark on the Laodiceas are taken almost verbatim from Chrysostom's homily on Colossians 4:16. Chrysostom's commentary implies that there may be some confusion regarding the identity of the letter from Laodicea, and some people assume a so-called letter to the Laodiceans to be the one mentioned in Colossians 4:16. To safeguard the church from the forged epistle, Chrysostom quoted an unnamed source to clarify that the letter was not sent by Paul to the Laodiceans, but from them to Paul. Chrysostom's theory, mediated through Ecumenian commentary, subsequently appears in the commentaries attributed to John of Damascus, dated from the 7th or early 8th century, as evidenced in the 10th century alternating catena manuscript GA 2110. The commentary of Damascus also identifies as 1 Timothy as the letter written by the Laodiceans to Paul. The same exegetical tradition continued to impact the commentary of Theophylact in the 11th century. Theophylact's commentary, presented in alternating catena manuscripts, appears in several manuscripts, including GA 2104. Following Chrysostom's exegetical tradition, Theophylact articulated the remark in his own words. Theophylact admitted that he was unaware of any specific charges noted in the letter. However, Chrysostom's theory was incorporated into subsequent commentaries, along with an explicit assertion of 1 Timothy as the letter from Laodicea mentioned in Colossians 4:16. This assertion is not limited in two scholia or commentaries of Colossians. It is also found in the subscription to Colossians in several manuscripts, including GA 424. After presenting the prominence of Colossians, the subscription proceeds to identify the letter from Laodicea as 1 Timothy. It adds a further comment. For the second letter to Timothy was written in Laodicea. There seems to be some confusion regarding the 1st and 2nd Timothy. The confusion is likely to have originated at an early stage, since both letters to Timothy are assigned to Laodicea in the subscriptions of the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus. The scribe of GA 1828 may have noticed the discrepancy and ended the subscription at the word anaknote. The examination of paratexts of Colossians indicates that 1 Timothy was well received as the Pauline letter from Laodicea, referenced in Colossians 4:16. There have been conflicting theories regarding the identity of the letter from Laodicea. The expression Laodiceas can be interpreted as the letter to be obtained or written from Laodicea. When taken in the latter sense, the phrase can be understood as the letter written from Laodicea to Paul or by Paul. Let's look at the theory of a Pauline letter to the Laodiceans. The identity of the letter has been the subject of considerable interest since ancient times. In the 2nd century, an epistle to the Laodiceans seemed to have been known to Marcion, who used the title for the letter sent to the Ephesians. The author of the Muratorian fragment was also aware of the circulation of an epistle to the Laodiceans during his time, and he made it clear that the epistle was forged in Paul's name to further the heresy of Marcion. By the close of the 4th century, Jerome noted that some read the epistle to the Laodicean, but it was rejected by everyone. The letter to the Laodiceans is not attested in any extant Greek manuscript. Still, the Greek title for the epistle appears in the 9th century Greek-Latin manuscript Codex Fuldensis, with an interlinear Latin translation written above the Greek title. The unusual spelling, Laodiceas, in the inscription of the Greek title betrays a translation from the Laodiceans in its Latin counterpart. There's no trace of the title for the epistle in its closely related Codex Fuldensis. The information about the epistle to the Laodiceans in Codex Fuldensis likely came from its Latin exemplar. Despite being rejected by Jerome and other ancient fathers, the letter to the Laodiceans has survived to the present day, largely preserved within the Latin tradition. And we'll hear more about the letter to the Laodicean from the next presenter. The earliest known example is found in the 6th century Codex Fuldensis, in which the argumentum to Laodiceans is nearly identical to the argumentum to 1 Timothy. While the text of Laodiceans is largely borrowed from Philippians, the striking resemblance of the argumenta in Codex Fuldensis may suggest a close affinity between the two letters in early exegetical tradition. Another theory is that the letter was written from Laodicea by the Laodiceans to Paul. As noted earlier, this theory was first presented in Chrysostom's homily on Colossians 4:16, where he quoted an anonymous source to clarify any confusion about the letter's identity. Chrysostom's theory was also advocated by other Antiochian church fathers. The late 4th century commentary by Theodore of Laodicea is preserved in Latin. Theodore's commentary on Colossians 4:16 offers more definitive indication that a forged letter to the Laodiceans was in circulation during his time. Following Chrysostom's interpretation, Theodore reasoned that the letter was written by the Laodiceans to Paul, which was presumed to have contained critiques intended for their neighboring churches in Colossae. Therefore, Paul instructed the Colossian church to read what had been said about them. Similarly, the 5th century commentary of Theodoret of Cyrus, as presented in the 13th century GA 1945, asserted that the letter was written by the Laodiceans to Paul, which may contain accusations regarding the Colossian church or similar issues faced by the two neighboring churches. The exact details of the letter's content remain unclear. The difficulty with this theory is that based on Colossians 2:1, Paul may not have visited the churches of Colossae and Laodicea in person. Nevertheless, the Antiochian Fathers' remarks offer valuable insights into the history and reception of 1 Timothy. Another theory suggests that the letter from Laodicea was written not by the Laodiceans, but by Paul. Several epistles were proposed to be the Pauline letter written from Laodicea. These include 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatians, and 1 Timothy, according to J.B. Lightfoot. Nevertheless, 1 Timothy is the only epistle that has Laodicea identified as the letter's place of origin, attested in the majority of its paratexts, as well as paratexts in manuscripts of Colossians. Like the other theory, the problem with this hypothesis is that Paul may not have visited the churches of Colossae and Laodicea in person. Further, it is unlikely that Paul would have detoured from his journey to Macedonia in order to write a letter from Laodicea to Timothy, who was likely in Ephesus at that time. The reception of 1 Timothy as the letter from Laodicea seems to be linked to the exegetical tradition that originated from Chrysostom's homily on Colossians 4:16, which was intended to safeguard the church from a forged Pauline letter circulating in his time. In light of the 4th century Antiochian context, as noted by Martha Mitchell, Chrysostom was aware of the importance about Pauline consistency. He tended to reconcile the Pauline utterances in light of Acts. Likewise, Theodore, based on Acts, and argued that Paul must have visited the two Phrygian cities while traveling through Phrygia. While most modern scholars no longer use Acts to determine Paul's chronology, this line of thought persisted in the work of some critical scholars from the early 19th century. The question remains as to why 1 Timothy was claimed to be the Pauline letter from Laodicea. And if anyone knows the answer, please let me know. And given the exegetical context in the 4th and 5th century, it is possible that lay antique scribes and readers, they also noticed some discrepancies when compared 1 Timothy with Acts and other Pauline epistles. Nevertheless, they used paratexts to convey their reception of 1 Timothy's Pauline authorship and present the letter to be read as the Pauline letter from Laodicea, referenced in Colossians 4:16. To conclude, the study explores various paratexts related to 1 Timothy to demonstrate the importance of manuscript evidence for understanding the reception of the letter and the pastorals in general. The identification of Macedonia as the place of origin for 1 Timothy in some manuscripts suggests that scribes or readers of these manuscripts may have noticed that the information of Laodicea contradicts the text in 1 Timothy 1:3. However, the reception of 1 Timothy as written from Laodicea is found in most paratexts of 1 Timothy. In addition, the assertion is found in several paratexts of Colossians, with commentaries attributed to a certain Euthalius, Ecumenius, John of Damascus, and Theophilus, alongside Chrysostom's 4th century homily on Colossians 4:16, which was meant to protect the church from a forged letter. In light of the exegetical context in the 4th and 5th century, scribes and readers of late antiquity may have noticed some inconsistency when comparing 1 Timothy with Acts and other Pauline letters. Nevertheless, they used paratexts to convey their reception of the letter's Pauline authorship by placing the letter within the broader Pauline narrative and thereby safeguarding their Pauline status. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Are there questions for Lily?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting and inspiring. One question concerning the reading from Macedonia. Have you considered to link this to the placement of 1 Timothy after 2 Thessalonians in a large part of the Pauline corpus tradition?
Thank you for that question. For the attestation of Macedonians, in fact, some scholars, they argue that First Timothy was written by from Macedonia, and that's why there are some variants there. But for some scholars, they consider there are some inconsistencies when compared with First Corinthians and Acts, Pauline chronology, and that's why there's some inconsistencies in. But first, you said first or second Thessalonians.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about modern scholarship and their assessment of the situation, but rather ancient scribes or whoever added or modified those subscriptions. Whether they may have been influenced in this case by the placement of 1 Timothy after 2 Thessalonians being in Macedonia.
Actually, in manuscript tradition, First and Second Thessalonian, they were ascribed to Athens, not Macedonia.
Sure.
Yeah. So speaking of influence, that might not be a possibility. So,
Picking up on Lloyd's comment, there's also, and I think that the texts where you have Macedonia come in, they look to me like they were 11th, 12th century, but you also mentioned John Chrysostom a lot. And so you have Clement of Alexandria makes a comment about Paul's letter to the Macedonians, and then includes a short phrase. Completely unrelated to Clement, though, Chrysostom talks about Paul's letter to the Macedonians, and what he's citing is First Thessalonians and sometimes Philippians, and he kind of combines them. But if someone were reading Chrysostom or Clement, and they thought, oh, well, Paul must have written a letter to the Macedonians, I mean, that might have been kind of the way it came into the tradition. And you did mention Chrysostom a lot, so yeah, I mean, who knows?
I think I'm not the only one who mentioned him a lot.
Well, yeah, no.
Yes, and
not black the audit. If there are points of origin where Chrysostom comments, immediately one of those inspired the later reception. So the awful back to Chrysostom makes sense that it can't contain island
yeah, I would like to hear more about it. Yeah. So,
just one point where it said where you have to be seen. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a written source or even a particular person that he has in mind, but Chrysostom will often use that simply to sort of say a potential misunderstanding. Somebody might think this. Somebody might say this. So he thinks he's primarily really focused on the audience. So he's concerned that maybe this idea is going around and it could be a very sort of popular notion, not even something written down. So it's not necessarily a quotation, but this is sort of his rhetorical technique that he uses.
For sure. But the Theodore of Laodicea, that is more clear indication. So we know that it's from the same tradition, but it's added more of their interpretation.
I think, this might be our last question. Yeah.
I don't, maybe I didn't say, have you had a chance to look at the hypothesis of First Timothy? So you have one right there on the screen. You have Theodorus name written in the corner. That first scholia is actually a hypothesis that gives, I can't read it, so but it gives background of the book. And it will often talk about where it was written. Chrysostom also has one that travels in the Euthalian apparatus. today or brief explanation about, just wondering if they mentioned anything about this.
We don't know who's copying from who, because, you know, that's another things we don't know. for sure.
I only ask because, most of your points are coming from Antiochus, Laodicea, Theodoret, Chrysostom. The idea of putting the letter into a historical background comes from them. That was emphasized, that was started, I mean, even Nestorius was very big on this. And so part of that might be the fact that they're all copying from each other, especially Theodoret almost always copies whatever Theodore Laodicea says. They won't say almost the exact same thing. Chrysostom does sometimes as well, but you remember it. So in some ways, it's not always each person is coming up with something new, but they're simply repeating what has been passed down to them. And so it's not so much everyone believed this as much as everyone trusted the source that it came from. But the hypotheses sometimes will give you some indication of where it's coming from. So you could look at the titles, but I would recommend looking and trying to read through the hypothesis on First Timothy to see if there's anything more there.
Yeah, I would like to talk more with you.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.